Well, good evening, everybody. Is the mic on? Wonderful. I'm Paul Gavriluk, and I teach in the Theology department here at the University of St. Thomas, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you to our new lecture series entitled Interdisciplinary Conversations. This lecture series is supported by the Theology department, by the College of Arts and Sciences, and also by the Terence J. Murphy Institute for Catholic Thought, Law, and Public Policy. Our distinguished lecturer today is Professor Cyril O'Regan, who comes to us from the heights of the University of Notre Dame. Professor O'Regan was born in the city of Limerick, Southern Ireland. So during Q&A session, feel free to just freely launch into the type of poetry that would be readily recognizable in that part of the world. Professor O'Regan, at that point a student, crossed the pond in 1981 and went on to pursue his education, his master's and then subsequently doctorate at Yale Divinity School, where he was a student of Louis Dupré and also came under the influence of Hans Frey. Those of us more theologically informed will immediately recognize these two extraordinary intellectuals that have made major contributions to theological discourse in the 20th century. And as we shall see today, so is also Professor Cyril O'Regan. Upon completing his doctorate in 1989, Professor O'Regan continued his teaching in the 90s at Yale University. He subsequently went on to teach at the University of Notre Dame, where he is presently an endowed chair and a Huisking professor of theology, history of Christianity, and systematics. Professor O'Regan specializes in systematic theology and historical theology. He has specific interests in the intersection of continental philosophy and theology, religion and literature, mysticism, mystical theology, and postmodern thought. He has written 5 books, and he also has 2 books forthcoming. His first volume, which appeared in 1994, was entitled The Heterodox Hegel, where he essentially traced the history of German idealism, and particularly the philosophy of Hegel, precisely as a form of Christian heterodoxy. He went on to publish in 2001 a Gnostic Return in Modernity, and that was also a study of a number of instantiations or permutations of the Gnostic thought as they found their expression this side of the Enlightenment. In 2002, he published Gnostic Apocalypse, subtitled Jacob Boehmer's Haunted Narrative. And in 2009, he continued on the topic of apocalyptic, publishing Theology and the Spaces of the Apocalyptic. Speaking of the apocalyptic themes, most recently, Professor O'Regan has been intimately involved with the curriculum review at the University of Notre Dame. And I must say that it was precisely his public voice and his public presence that made an enormous difference to that review. I have to speak in riddles, for we have the Armageddon coming. Finally, in 2014, he published the first volume of his account of von Balthasar's theology under the title Anatomy of Misremembering, subtitled Balthasar's Response to Philosophical Modernity. And so the first volume of about 600 pages dealt with Hegel. He tells me that he has now finished the second volume, approximately of the same size, that will be dealing with von Balthasar's account of Heidegger. So the volume dealt essentially with the von Balthasar's critique of modernity by employing Hegel and Heidegger. And in many ways, the lecture that you are about to hear is a result of the reflections emanating from this book, although, as Professor Cyril O'Regan emphasizes, the lecture itself is actually a development of some of the ideas that did not find full development in this work. Professor O'Regan's lecture today is entitled Forgetting and Misremembering, Modernity and the Double Catastrophe of Theology. Please welcome Professor O'Regan.
First, my gratitude to Paul for inviting me here. Also, my gratitude to you for being here. It is Monday evening. There must be Monday Night Football someplace on some TV and so forth, and you're going to miss at least sort of the first half. That sort of already is a sacrifice. What I'm going to do sort of is that you were given a handout when you came in, and I'm saying this in particular with respect to the very ascetic, possibly inclined to sacrifice undergraduates who may have made this under coercion or may have made this trip under strong encouragement, that actually this is your friend, this handout. So what I'm going to do for 2 minutes is to go from part 1 to 3, not all 5 parts and so forth, before I start. And regard this as a vocabulary lesson, but philosophers and theologians, they do many, many different things. They may excite, inspire, bore, and so forth. Let's hope we do the first 2 and not the third. But one thing to do is they do give you vocabulary lessons. What are we talking about? What we're talking about depends upon how we are talking about it. So essentially what you have sort of on that beautifully produced blue, this is due to Paul. Paul apparently likes colors. I have my own white version here. But here's what I want to do. I want to talk about the big question, what is modernity? And there are 2 parts of that, and they're quite simple. The first part is that modernity could happen whether we think it's questionable or not. That is, we're worried about it having happened and who we are because it has happened. The kind of people that I want to talk about are the kind of people who actually think it is questionable, and that at the very minimum, there are huge losses sustained, while of course, obviously, sort of we're going on the mantle that there have been extraordinary gains. So first of all, it's questionable. The second is, there's a question. It is not the same thing as it being questionable. One of the things we might ask is, what is this envelopment? That is, this world of assumption that we bring assumptions to the table because we are who we are, where we are. And what kind of assumptions are those? One set of assumptions, this is what originally we think of as the Enlightenment is, that the Enlightenment is question all, reason all, have procedures for finding out the truth of all, and so forth. That happened at a particular time in different places in what we call the modern period from the 16th century on. That remains to a large extent our world. But also the view sort of that human beings are more nearly ethical or ought to be ethical than religious, because religion, after all, sometimes leads to unethical behavior, that also belongs to that fold. Whether you're a believer or not, somehow or other, that sort of will occur to you, or you'll hear it in the media. That is, perhaps it's better sort of to be ethical and moral than it is to be religious. That comes from aware, as somewhere, or once upon a time, we have all ingested it. It is who we are. It's one of the natural defaults. But then there's a question is that the only thing? Is that the only set of assumptions that we have? And I want to say, no, it's not the only set of assumptions we might have. I want to say that also, long before Christianity began to really, really worry about the Enlightenment, about modernity, other people who were more or less, but not quite Christian, also worried about it and tried to repair it. This repair job, whereby let's take everything positive from the Enlightenment, let's at the same time correct for things that they have lost on us, let's say our sense of community, our sense of being with nature and so forth, which once upon a time a Catholic form of Christianity might have provided. Let's do that, but let's do it without God. Let's do it sort of without the God who's transcendent. That's another fold. We simultaneously occupy both of those, I want to say. Modernity is questionable. Then the question is there one, the first, or is there two? I want to argue there's two, and theology has to take care of two. And number two is, before we get to our theologians who are Hans-Urs von Balthasar and Henri de Lubac, that is so-called examples of Nouvelle Theologie, and they're looking at modernity, which they look at it as two problems, related problems. I thought for those of you, either who know or have heard of Charles Taylor, that Charles Taylor, I assume, sort of would give you a pretty good pedigree of someone providing a description of what modernity is and what benefits it gives us and what challenges. I'm going to use that sort of as, once I have sort of stated sort of a few things about the questionability in the question, I will move fairly quickly to him. I won't get into too much detail, but I'd use him as an entree with respect to Hans-Urs von Balthasar and Henri de Lubac, where they're problematizing that there are two different things that we have to deal with. The first one is forgetting. If the Enlightenment works, it works as a prescription against remembering a Christian tradition or remembering any tradition. That's forgetting. The second fold is, well, we have to overcome forgetting. But the question is, we also have incentives not to remember what Christianity is. We want actually an alternative. That's what they call misremembering. I want to say that to some extent Charles Taylor prepares the way for giving that analysis, and that analysis thereafter is going to be prosecuted by two theologians who actually anticipated him and got there before him. Hans-Urs von Balthasar was talking about this long before Charles Taylor started talking, and so also is the case in Henri de Lubac. That's the resume. I think you're entitled to a resume, and if and when sort of you lose the thread, this is your bailout. This is your map. This is your compass. You can find your way back to this. That's about as much pedagogic sensitivity as I'm capable of. But you have turned up. I think I owe you something. I owe you the prospect of coherence and the prospect of this you might find meaningful. So now I begin. Given my task of speaking to forgetting, misremembering, modernity, and catastrophe, I love the four pair. It is only right that I begin by talking about the weather. This is Minnesota. I ought to talk about the weather. Now, I have the best of role models for this. Robert Musil, the early 20th century Austrian novelist who wrote one of the most unflattering exposés of modernity in his multi-volume A Man Without Qualities, written, I think, between 1930 and 1943. He begins his great novel with a meteorological report about a cold front coming in from the west. The opening of the book, a weather report. This is a great high culture novel, interesting, weather report. The book mimes, renders ironic, and elevates weather reporting, and scores a bullseye in its insinuation that the meteorological condition does not simply provide the background scenery of and for human disposition and actions. Rather, it is a happening in the strict sense. It's an event. Indeed, one that augurs and confirms an entirely new manifold of thought. And not really thought, but disposition and action as well. And this new manifold has a reductive rationalist pattern that excises and cuts off our relation to the past, our relation to each other, as well as, in general, depleting our basic humanity. Now, as the novel proceeds, we discover that the cold is the sign of the disintegration of the relation between reason and will in each of us, which in turn ultimately undoes both. The fragmentation reduces reason to mere use and will to the basest desire. Although by the nature of the case, cold fronts and warm fronts are passing, this particular cold front is not. It turns out to be the sign of an interminable winter in which our dreams turn lurid in order to compensate for the cold or compensate for reason. Here Musil seems to offer on the social scale what that other Viennese intellectual, Freud, offered on the individual. Although Musil remains descriptive and apparently uncommitted, it is evident that this cold front is a catastrophe in the etymological sense. Catastrophe, a radical turning about or revolution in which our lives no longer provide a definite form shaped by and towards a determinable ethos that we can take for granted. We, us, now modern, caught in this winter, we speculate on visions of ourselves on the screen of possibility. We can be anything, we can be everything, because with the cold, the modern, we are no longer anything. Now, since it's a rule that the best of literature will go out of date, this also happens here, I think we can leave Musil where he is or where he was. That is in Vienna at the dawn of the emergence of the Third Reich and the sordid coincidence of cold and heat of National Socialism. I want to turn now to our contemporary weather channel for assistance in further specifying the modern condition that is perhaps more complex than that envisaged by Musil. Minnesota is a place for weather reports. I lived here for a few years. Now, taking a measure of latitude with respect to scientific explanation, which is beyond me, we might say, storms, we might say that extreme weather events happen when cold and hot air meet and essentially wrap around each other. We can make this too into an image of modernity, but only by having a significant trace of irony. We have to imagine that, like Musil's cold front, the kind of severe weather event about which we are talking is more universal than local, and once again, is not passing. It settles over us, and we abide within it. I want to focus on the wrapping around of two bands of air, a kind of helix of cold, initial enlightenment and rationalism, and warm, that is supposed to characterize where we are at, and thus the somewhat different beings we have become, and how we deal or fail to deal with who we are before the weather disturbance, the catastrophe, change things utterly. Really? An author whom one doesn't read anymore, and weather reports. What light can they shine on our modern condition? Surely this is the business of philosophy or sociology and history to inform us of the novelty of our mental habits, our practices, and ways of living, and provide something like a map showing us how we arrived at our new dispensation. That's their job, not weather reporting. It is true that philosophy in particular has made singular contributions and demonstrated how genealogy, accounts of how we got to where we've got, is every bit as important as conceptual analysis. We will have to forsake literary allusion and weather reports very shortly for philosophy as a by-station of our move to theology. Still, we may have come to know something through the meteorological analogies that we might not have known. That is, modernity can be understood to be constituted by a single band of rationalist assumption, buoyed up by rationalist method, which neglects or forgets the past and forgets the forgetting of the past, and so forth. At the same time, modernity can be understood to be constituted by a double band of assumption, a complex weave on the one hand of scientific and ethical forms of reason as they disseminate throughout the entire society, but also the many attempts to heal the split into reason and feeling, thought and desire, as well as attempts to compensate for the felt lack of solidity in practices and forms of life which are no longer embedded in the way things are. Now let's move to Charles Taylor, who's going to be our philosophical guide. So I'll give you a digest of what his particular position is. Now, as already indicated, there exists a group of thinkers for whom modernity is not made up of one, but two bands of discourse and the corresponding practices and forms of life. The second band of discourse, while continuing to endorse the world and humanity at the expense of the God of Christian witness, does demonstrate a desire to reunite thought and feeling and find practical means to overcome the fragmentation and anomie of modernity. And, finally, to reintroduce the sacred, gradually erased as reason shows its value in understanding the natural and social worlds. Christianity is not the only resacralizing powers in the modern world. Yet whatever interest there is in resacralizing the world, and much of our contemporary is to resacralize the world by means other than Christianity, there is no commitment to bringing back either the Christian God of theism or the sovereign and apparently arbitrary God of Christian scriptures. Strands in this band of discourse include German and English Romanticism, German idealism, American Transcendentalism, and William James, perhaps the various forms of vitalism, not excluding that of Friedrich Nietzsche, and possibly also process theology and various forms of feminism. But rather than supply an inventory here, as a kind of shorthand, we can adduce one of my favorite philosophers, Charles Taylor, as a more or less exemplary instance of a philosopher this time, committed to describing modernity as consisting of two bands or strands of thought and disposition. And this is crucial because if you frame the question of how will it go with Christianity in modernity, you have to understand what is modernity. Are there one or two bands? And each band will have multiple discourses. So when you talk about what is the challenge of modernity to Christianity, you better have some real sense as to the different kinds of challenges Christianity will face in the 21st century. So this is not a matter, it's not simply a matter of being academic. Indeed, it could be argued that naming the two-band constitution of our modern mindset, practice and form of life, constitutes the agenda of Charles Taylor. Obviously, many of the faculty will have read Charles Taylor, and perhaps some of you might have read some part of The Secular Age, which is longer even the books I write. So Charles Taylor, the best expression of which, of course, he's written many things, of course, is the encyclopedic The Secular Age. Famously, if you want a slogan, modernity is described by the immanent frame. This frame, immanent frame, which closes off transcendence, serves as a default which shapes our involuntary responses to our social reality. It encourages certain ways of thinking about the world while excluding others. We can, for example, think of the world as purely material and subject to the laws of physics, and of ourselves as purely material beings for whom consciousness and self-consciousness are epiphenomena, that is, arise from a material base. On the other hand, we can think of there being a space for ethical behavior as being relatively independent of natural laws. It also belongs to modernity, or as their highest expression. At the same time, again, we can think of our social world as made up of greedy egos, each seeking his and her own, or as consisting of rational entities looking for the proper equation whereby to construct a thoughtful, rational society. All of those different opinions belong to the first band of the Enlightenment. This would be all of this, to think according to the pattern of the Enlightenment. And all of us do, sort of as a natural default, I want to say. Equally, however, within the immanent frame, we can think of the world as a kind of whole, not only greater than the sum of its parts, but of human beings having the capacity to see and embrace this form of transcendence in immanence, and reproduce such transcendence, worldly transcendence, in new practices and forms of life. Even worlds without God does not mean that we become inhumane, for instance. We might, in fact, become more humane. In his magisterial texts as elsewhere, it is obvious that Taylor takes German idealism and both English and German Romanticism to be exemplary. In any event, in the second of the two bands that constitute the immanent frame, the kind of corrective one, the more holistic one, the more spiritual one, while religion is not dismissed, avowals couched in the standard vocabulary of the transcendent God who made the world as inexplicable gift and equally inexplicably repaired it, these are put out of circulation. Of course, Christian believers will still be with us, fortunately or unfortunately, but essentially they are survivors or remnants of a historical world that has had its day. Pre-modern forms of religion may remain with us, but in the mode of anachronism or maybe reaction. This is Taylor the historicist. Taylor himself is not hostile to traditional forms of Christianity and arguably has affection for them and the kinds of selves it produced. Simply as a matter of logic, the claims of Christianity might be true, though Taylor obviously thinks that it can't be proved. But in any event, traditional forms of Christianity are supremely disadvantaged since they cut against the historical grain. There's been a happening, and Christianity looks as if it's anachronistic at best. And we, who are Christians, are simply survivors and unholy remnants of a past age. Taylor, who I'm using as a launching pad, is a Catholic. So I do not believe it does him an injustice to say that there's not a great deal in his work to connect him to the Catholic theological tradition in a substantive way, even if one suspects he rather likes the Catholic emphasis on community on the one hand and on sacramentality on the other. Things are now as they are, he suggests, because this is the way they shook out. It is true that the shaking out is contingent, yet this colossal shift in percept, concept, and action now seems to have taken on the shape of the order of things. The sole available response we have, since its ubiquity, its everywhereness pushes beyond our control, is to accept it. Besides avoiding behaving as a modern-day Jeremiah and Cassandra, is for Taylor, well, the responsibility of the civilized. But it's not only civility and a kind of stoicism that prevents Taylor going on the attack. It's also the conviction of the goods modernity has delivered, the value of inquiry and discovery, as well as the actual discoveries that have expanded our imagination and made our lives less slavish. These are goods. The genesis of human rights, our greater awareness of our common responsibilities to each other, and perhaps also an emergent sense of our embeddedness in nature, which envelops us and for which we are responsible. Regrets there are a few. The lack of connection between selves which once upon a time porously interconnected, and the loss of practices, or at least their meaning, which joined us to each other and to the cosmos. Taylor is the consummate example of the philosopher as the great accountant summing up losses and gains in the credit and debit column. It is not clear that he comes to a conclusion himself, and that he does not leave it to others to bring in verdicts of worth it, not worth it. But he does encourage all of us to get clear what has come and what has gone, and how we are weighing losses and gains in a situation that amounts to nothing less than a revolution. That is, a rotation of the axis of the world that constructs a new world. That's two. Now we move on to the point of the talk, which is to talk about particular forms of Catholic theology as it responds to the double challenge of modernity. I've been speaking thus far, with Taylor as my main guide, about how one can offer two rather different characterizations of the constitution of modernity. The one of the two-band view, a view which considers modernity as constituted by displacement of pre-modern ways of viewing the world and pre-modern Christianity, and a more complex view, which, while it agrees that the first is foundational, insists that modernity also attempts to replace pre-modern religious thought and practice by thoughts and practices that have the same function, but nonetheless do not reinscribe religious institutions of authority or doctrines and transcendence in the form of an absolutely transcendent deity and his irreplaceable mediator, Jesus Christ. Taylor exercises, as I've indicated, the second and more complex option. And from an analytic or diagnostic point of view, it seems to be the more adequate of the two. One can celebrate or mourn Christianity being displaced and at the same time being replaced by something else. One can celebrate or mourn the forgetting of tradition, that is the badge of honor of the Enlightenment band of modernity. One can celebrate or mourn forms of thought such as romanticism, idealism, transcendentalism, depth ecology, and New Age spirituality that fills the void left by the displacement of Christianity from the center by refiguring religious imagination and offering as an alternative to Christianity and the nesting and braiding function it served, something so that it will secure the imagination and so that it will inspire. As I said, however, my real interest is in how Catholic theology considers the catastrophe of modernity and whether it thinks it has to respond to it as made up of one or two ideological bands. Of course, the variety and complexity of response over the past few centuries is not amenable to sketch, although there are various sketches that cover different aspects of the shift in more manageable timeframes than I am talking about now. It is true that the Catholic response has not been uniformly negative. While modernity as a whole and in all its aspects has rarely been enthusiastically embraced, Catholicism has, in general, affirmed scientific method, even if it fairly consistently expresses reservations regarding extending this mentality into the area of the human person and the human community. Gaudium et Spes can serve as an index of a broader pattern of Catholic thinking about modernity. Now, I have a more particular interest here. That is, I would like to examine the way in which Catholic thinkers of Nouvelle Theologie vintage were troubled by the new and complex weather system, and whether this catastrophe was viewed as presenting challenges unlike anything presented Christianity over 2 millennia, not excluding the Reformation. The two examples of Nouvelle Theologie I want to concentrate on are provided by the work of Henri de Lubac and Hans-Urs von Balthasar. And de Lubac is writing from approximately 1925-ish, almost the 80s, and Hans-Urs von Balthasar is writing roughly at the same time, though Hans-Urs von Balthasar is 20 years younger. Now, given their general stature within the movement called Nouvelle Theologie, their choice is relatively, I think, uncontroversial. What I find most interesting is that both Catholic theologians anticipate Taylor's two-band construction of the social imaginary of modernity. They both think of the Enlightenment as a studied forgetting of everything about the past, and especially about a God-oriented universe. But they are just, if not more interested, in the subsequently emerging forms of thought that are critical of the unintended consequences of the new paradigm and want to correct it, without, however, regressing to pre-modern Christian forms of thought and ways of being in the world. If the first ideological band of modernity can be characterized as, and underscore, displacement and forgetting, we could speak of the second ideological band being characterized by replacement and misremembering. So let's do them seriatim. Let's deal with how Balthasar and Henri de Lubac deal with forgetting. That is, with the first band of modernity, the one with which we're more familiar. With regard to the first band of the two-band complex of modernity, neither de Lubac nor Balthasar write a classic text against the Enlightenment. We do find liberally scattered throughout their works, however, stabs in their own name or under proxies against the anthropological turn of modernity, the invidious rule of method and evidence when it comes to Christianity, and the whole-scale reduction of Christianity to ethics. With regard to the Enlightenment band of modernity, Nouvelle Theologie, interestingly, more nearly operates in the mode of response than in the mode of diagnosis. The distinction will become clear. It takes for granted a general outline of the displacement of Christianity from the center of Western thought, imagination, practice, and form of life, and assumes that despite the benefits that modernity has provided, that it is essentially hostile to Christianity. The issue becomes how best for Catholicism to respond to the Enlightenment, which continues to argue its case, even as it has made its way into the order of assumption. The Enlightenment continues to argue itself, though everyone is dominated by that which it argues for. As the Lubac and Balthasar begin their writing careers, a certain vocabulary of Catholic response has already been established. The main frame of the Catholic response is reactive, if not reactionary, and is characterized by a studied withdrawal from negotiation with the modern world, which, while spotty, was a feature of the middle of the 19th century. The second minor frame is exhibited by modernists such as Loisy and Tyrrell. Whether the issue is newfangled ways to interpret the biblical text or conceptions of the church as more nearly democratic than hierarchical, ideas such as these serve as both cause and effect of the insistence on indefectible church authority and indefeasible theological guides. The theological venture of the Lubac and Balthasar says no to both. Neo-scholasticism is at once an expression of despair regarding the possibility of the church's ability to evangelize in the modern world, even as it paradoxically operates largely in the same narrow mode of demonstration that characterizes the modern mentality. The claims made on behalf of demonstrative reason, both inside and outside the church, need to be deflated, and the Lubac and Balthasar agree with Vatican I's insistence, well, as a minimum for Christian negotiation with the ideology of modernity, that yes, that it should be allowed that some realities exceed reason, and that reason on important matters necessarily has to rely on the Christian tradition, rather than on the flawed and fallible testimony of a prideful individual. Although the Lubac and Balthasar tend to agree with the overall diagnosis of secular reason prosecuted in Vatican II, they also think that the Catholic response is radically deficient and hardly rises to the kind of bold demonstration of Christian witness required to meet the monumental level of challenge. With respect to the first band of ideological modernity, Nouvelle Theology represents a third way. It eschews modernism because of what it regards as uncritical borrowing from secular disciplines, thereby yielding to the forgetting characteristic of modernity. It also eschews neo-scholasticism, because on the one hand, neo-scholasticism repeats some of the more egregious rationalist elements of ideological modernity, and on the other, its self-imposed isolationism and its dogmatic insistence on church authority really cedes the public space and thus grants victory to the imperialism of reason that brooks no remainder. The Lubac and Balthasar agree with neo-scholasticism that modernity is characterized by a form of forgetting of the Christian tradition, and a turn to the human subject and her projects that alters the traditional Christian world of thought and action entirely. Should this reign become universal, then it is difficult to see what role God, Christ, sacrament, prayer, and the church could possibly play in the present and in the future. That neither is hopeless about the prospects of Christianity indicate not only that they're not resigned to historical faith of the death of Christianity, but also that the first ideological band of the Enlightenment or modernity does not have exclusive sway, mainly because it does not satisfy or requite all human yearning for meaning, value, and truth. Nonetheless, the way to contend with this form of ideological modernity cannot simply be to continue to demonize it or even to characterize it as a form of forgetting. While to say that an individual or society is characterized by forgetting is hardly, I take it, to extend the compliment. It does not touch on the issue of the value of the Christian memory that has been lost. Forensically, argumentatively, one might want to point to the church as the preserver of tradition and thus as memory. But again, this provides little traction in a situation where there are grievances concerning the authoritarianism and general malfeasance of the church. We have a repetition in the 21st century. Even in those pockets of secular culture where there are offsets between memory of ecclesial peccadillos and wisp of nostalgia, the church has more than historical artifact, and anything more than another institution among institutions, has become more or less unintelligible. Both de Lubac and Balthasar are convinced that articulating the relation of the Church to ideological modernity has to proceed persuasively rather than argumentatively. Not that modernity is wrong, but rather why modernity is wrong is the real issue. A more effective way to combat ideological modernity than positivistically pointing to the Church as the bastion or keep of memory is to bring forward through memory what has been forgotten, as well as suggest its dimensions, the dimensions of memory. This is at once to show the price of forgetting and also provide incentives for memory. If memory of compelling examples of thought, practice, and forms of life are brought into view, then the likelihood is that the list of examples can and will go on. What de Lubac and Balthasar attempt to do, therefore, is to retrieve a Catholic past that is plural and also coherent, and also a past animated by a reality that not only notionally exceeds reason, but exceeds it in such a way that it draws it up. This provides the raison d'etre in both cases for the historical studies on particular figures and more general habits of thought, which represent alternatives to ideological modernity's contraction of the scope of inquiry as well as its definition. Let me talk about de Lubac for a moment. De Lubac's great studies on Origen and Augustine, on nature and grace, and his even greater contribution in the monumental multi-volume The Senses of Scripture, are intended to persuade the Christian of the value of remembering what is absolutely essential in a time marked by forgetting. Origen, Augustine, and past readers of Scripture bespeak a past that still matters and has the power to shape our religious imaginations after modernity, but also after the Catholic reaction, which made matters worse insofar as it still prioritizes logic, and simply added to it the authority of the Church, and especially the magisterium, as a supplement when reason was scheduled to run aground. One could make a similar point about Hans Urs von Balthasar, who was mentored by de Lubac. The rationale of Balthasar's studies in the early 40s on Origen, Gregory of Nyssa, and Maximus the Confessor is not demonstrated competence in the history of Christian thought. It had quite a bit. But rather, the illustration of a plurality of Christian mindfulness worthy of retrieval in the modern age, and whose interpretive and intellectual sophistication justified contemporary hearing. The same can be said of Balthasar's later studies of Augustine, Anselm, Bonaventure, which make their way sort of into his great trilogy. With regard to modern, more or less rationalist forms of interpretation of Scripture, Balthasar's attitude is pretty much identical to that of de Lubac. His approach, however, is two-pronged. It is often indirect, like de Lubac, in that it puts into operation more holistic and more self-transformatory ways of reading Scripture. It also can be more directly critical of the regime of historical critical method. In a number of texts in the Great Trilogy, Balthasar proceeds to show that historical critical method is the exclusive method deployed. If it is the exclusive method deployed, then the break with the pre-modern is confirmed, absolutely confirmed, in which case we lose all sense of the uniqueness of Scripture as the Word of God, and thus being different in kind from other classic texts, being different in kind. Balthasar develops the retrieval of Christianity by insisting on the continued value of the disposition and practice of prayer, and also the openness to the sacramental nature of reality in general, and liturgy in particular, which supports and is supported by a sacramental imagination. This brings me to my final point with regard to typical ways in which Nouvelle Theologie deploys a logic of persuasion regarding memory in the modern age. Although we can see clearly a view of tradition as productive rather than reproductive memory in operation in both of these authors, neither provides us with a fully articulated view of tradition that we sometimes can find in the 19th century. But so that this does not mean that in the work of either theologian, I think we'll leave that sort of page go by the way. Okay. All that sort of is important. Where is the real genius of Nouvelle Theologie? here I'm going to develop the argument, it is actually in response to the second kind, the second band. The particular genius of Nouvelle Theology's problematization and response to ideological modernity, however, is not given exclusively or even primarily in its performance of memory against an ideological modernity predicated on forgetting. This would limit Catholic response to the first band or fold of modernity. Formally, this would make Nouvelle Theologie much like Vatican I and counter-modern, and more counter-modern than in fact it is. What I want to say is that Nouvelle Theologie also deals with, and primarily with, the second band of discourses and the correlative practices and forms of life that sometimes constitute extra-ecclesial critical responses to modernity, characterized by overweening reason. Lubac and Balthasar grasp well that in their rejection of the imperialistic claims of reason, Christianity makes common cause with multiple forms of modern thought, which are synthetic rather than analytic in nature, which offer an imaginatively appealing picture of the human and natural world and their relations. The issue for both theologians is whether common cause means common ground, and whether the discourses and implied practices of romanticism, idealism, and vitalism more nearly facilitate a recovery of pre-modern forms of Christianity, or whether they make such recovery even more unlikely by, on the one hand, by taking over the integrative function Christianity once held in Western Christianity, and on the other, by actually mimicking the language of Christianity and its facility, in this facility by talking about the divine. De Lubac and Balthasar are both convinced that these discourses belong to the second band. Hegel, Schelling, Romantics, Coleridge, Wordsworth, etc., Goethe, are more intellectually and aesthetically satisfying than the discourses of the Enlightenment. And they are likely to alleviate the rampant individualism of modernity, as well as the split that hyper-reason introduced into the modern subject. So they're functioning as therapy. They are both prepared to accord these discourses considerably greater value than the discourses and practices of the Enlightenment. These discourses, however, present challenges to Christianity already traumatized by the imperialism of reason and the anthropological turn. These challenges, while different, are no less serious than those proposed by the Enlightenment. De Lubac and Balthasar worry about romantic and idealist discourses coming to function as Christian substitutes in the modern world, and about the temptation, quite literally the temptation, of Christians inserting their beliefs in these new frames and thus constructing counterfeits of the real thing. The new problem, an even bigger problem, is not so much the displacement of Christianity by the pledge made to reason, but by the replacement of Christianity in the discourses that sacralize humanity, the cosmos, or both. Put another way, or put in another register, the new problem is not so much forgetting, though forgetting never goes away, as misremembering. That is, the problem is giving sanction to interesting modes of the recovery of free-floating religious elements, including genuine Christian elements, and assigning to them a Christian label, or at the very least entertaining the idea that they are compatible with the Christian story of creation and redemption, which, as we all know, involves the interaction between God and the world and God and humanity. The problem is the frame of reference, which it turns out is the problem of what Taylor has called the immanent frame in its reductively naturalistic and supernaturalistic forms. Now, at this particular point, I'm on three of the list. Coming after this, which I'm not actually going to get into, I'm going to stop fairly soon. I develop in detail, in and through the text of de Lubac, the particular ways in which they handle these particular discourses as substitutes for Christianity, and having a kind of appeal that Christianity does not have, because Christianity seems to again, reinscribe the transcendent, the old hoary God, sort of God the Father, has sort of Christ as the once upon a time guy sort of who did something for me that I couldn't do for myself apparently, but I don't really believe that anymore, etc. So the kind of work I do begins at this particular juncture. That is, the kind of work I do sort of will detail the ways in which they respond to these discourses, the way in which they have particular targets. So for instance, both Balthasar and de Lubac have targets in German idealism. They have targets sort of in Marxism. Sometimes de Lubac has a target in Nietzsche. Balthasar has a target in Hegel, 688-page book written on this. Another 688, 700-page book, and another target being the target in Heidegger. But I think sort of, for the purpose of now, what I've just given you sort of will function as a kind of preface. What are the larger issues involved? And why sort of would someone like me, someone sort of hopefully sort of who is a human being as well sort of as a wonk, why would someone like me sort of spend probably will be 1,400 pages sort of with respect to this particular problem talking about these two theologians? What sort of is the motivation with respect to it? And what I've given you is, this is the motivation with respect to it. That is, modernity is not something we analyze. And if we analyze it, we analyze who we are. And that what I want to say is that our world of assumption and our mentality, literally our mentality, that is, the ways in which sort of we sort of are built up to have, if like, programmed answers to things, to be outraged with respect to when religion, so that people seem to take religion really seriously as opposed to kind of seriously, and so forth, right? That's pre-programming. This is where we are. And the fact sort of that you have someone telling you that's a problem does not mean that he, in this instance me, will not be programmed in a certain way. So theology and philosophy are reflective enterprises, but they're not reflective enterprises with respect to your particular sins. They're reflective enterprises with respect to all our sins in which sort of the speaker is implicated. I want to say that when I use that weather metaphor, I kind of wanted to take it seriously. As I said, I'm in Minnesota. But think about the layering of your consciousness and the layering of your supposition and assumption. It's very difficult for us to unearth our assumptions because our assumptions are that which we think by. We don't prove them, right? Once upon a time, the pre-modern world, we didn't think about Christianity, we thought through Christianity. So the question of modernity is, what do we think through? What sort of is going to be, if you like, the intellectual, emotional grinder in and through which sort of we're going to receive our information? So my interest, I think, this evening is to say, of course we have the old modernity, the one that started in the 16th century with us. That continues in terms of rationalization of things, sort of productivity, sort of instrumentalization, and so forth. Each of us is the value sort of what we do. There's a market price put on us. I have a market price at Notre Dame. Professors here have a market price at St. Thomas. You students have a market price, well, of debt, and eventually sort of presumably you'll be out of debt. But there is a market price. That sort of has all got to do with the function of the first band of discourse in modernity. And being an ethical person, for instance, also belongs to that. It's not just simply the first band of modernity, you move from being a nice Christian to being sort of being a human rat. No, you move from being sort of a probably not so nice Christian to being an ethical, upstanding citizen, among other things. Rationally sort of enlightened and sort of ethically proper, right? What I wanted to say was that we think we have got a grip on that, but modernity is even more serious because there's another layer that we have to deal with. And the other layer is warmer. The other layer sort of is not sort of quite so rational. We can sometimes think of it as a reaction precisely to that sort of first layer, whereby we do have a sense of that it's one thing sort of to admit to being rational. It's one thing to have vocation to be rational, but actually to be purely rational about all the things that might matter, your relationships and so forth, surely we need sort of something other than that. The Romantics understood that. The Idealists understood that. Surely we need something more than a management in society. That is, to each his own, sort of, and sort of we'll have juridical procedures whereby sort of we manage sort of wherever there's going to be conflict. Surely we might actually have a much more primitive notion of community that we're in relation to each other sort of before, in fact, sort of we're isolated individuals, etc. But where did that come from? Where did that emerge? That emerged in the late 18th century, And that also is with us as another kind of tableau, sort of another fold of things, which we have to deal with if you're a Christian. The danger of this one, the second fold, is it looks a lot more like Christianity than the first one did. The first one, so there's no, we had spasm with respect to how to deal with it, usually kind of just rejection, unenlightened rejection and so forth. And we have probably somewhat, but not quite made our peace. The second one, however, gives us a kind of what now is labeled religion without religion, a kind of dispersed religiousness because I'm at one with nature. I'm a believer in depth ecology. The world matters, whether it's chaos or something else. These are the latest manifestations of things which have started in the 18th century. These are not 21st century phenomena. These are repetitions of some things which were emerging in the 18th century. This also constitutes a layer of our psyche. This double layer, and particularly the second layer looks like Christianity. It looks good enough to be a substitute. It is a substitute. The substitutes we know the substitute nature because various things that you would think belong grammatically to Christians. That is, Christians have a certain kind of language. We may sort of have different Christological formations, but we assume that Christ sort of is the Redeemer of the world and so forth. That Christians have a belief system which assumes that or suggests that God is radically transcendent with respect to the world, even though that radical transcendence of God with respect to the world does not prohibit God being immanent within the world. But so radically transcendent. The world is created as a gift. We do not redeem ourselves. We do not redeem ourselves. We do not have the capability. Christ redeems us and so forth. Those things are prescribed. We can have religion within the immanent frame, which will not break out to a real transcendence. Now we have the second fold, the second challenge, the second temptation, and what de Lubac and Hans-Olof von Balthasar are asking. First of all, we have to diagnose it as a temptation. We have an ersatz, a substitute, a counterfeit. We have to be able to diagnose it as such. We have to deal with it. And then so we have to then, the task of theology is for theology to declare itself again in a new language, the old grammar, against no longer one set of assumptions, but another set of assumptions. To understand what Nouvelle Theology is doing, to understand what Henri de Lubac is doing sort of over God knows how many pages, probably 20,000. And I imagine Hans-Olof von Balthasar is a lot more than 20,000 pages. What they're doing, I think, is zeroing in sort of on this double culpability, double problem, double world of assumption. And we can only be Christian by understanding both of these have to be dealt with. We have to make our way through it because we are it while we are critiquing it. That's the essential point. That's the preface to the two sort of almost 700-page books. But I don't think you need sort of a kind of précis as to sort of what my book was about. What I do think you should remember is this thing about modernity goes around sort of as a kind of slogan. But the talk about modernity is pretty fundamental because it is the talk about modernity which is objectified is always and everywhere a talk about what the historical conditions and ideological conditions have made us and whether or not it fosters the best form of humanity so that we can realize. It also asks the question whether so that we can be religious as we also can be human. And it asks the question, what is the best religion so that to be so that the best kind of human being so that you could possibly be? Those, I think, are important questions and do not depend upon sort of 700-page books on Hans-Olof von Balthasar for them to actually have some meaning. Thank you very much. That's right.
Yeah, as I was listening to your paper, which I think is fascinating, I kept thinking that Karl Barth is really sort of almost the Protestant analog of these two thinkers. I don't know if you've studied him much, but
Yes, I have.
it's a similar thing that he thinks there are these two bands, and he was kind of obsessed with 19th century and Hegel, but also Schleiermacher.
That's right. That's right.
And whether or not he should continue with his, I'm going to declare war on this church father, and
That's right.
you know, the gun is trained on him,
That's right.
or
That's right.
whether that wasn't too harsh and so on. And if you think that's true, that there's a sign of analog there,
Yep.
if one could draw any conclusions from that about maybe God's rulership over the whole church, not just the Catholic Church, but the Protestant Church, or and maybe prospects for ecumenism. I don't know, just some thought.
Right. Look, this is a great question. So first of all, let me sustain sort of the motivation sort of for the question, because I think that you saw an analogy, and I think the analogy is there. So on the Protestant side, on the Reform side in particular, Karl Barth is asking the question, is theology possible, but even more importantly, is Christianity possible in the 20th century? And he's asking the question sort of as to whether or not theology itself is either making Christianity possible or impossible. And the initial answer, sort of, which comes sort of, in the famous lectures in Romans, is that theology is making Christianity impossible. And it's making it impossible precisely because there are two different forms of making it impossible. One which belongs to rationalism, and the other is more warm, the warm front. And the warm front sort of is indicated by Friedrich Schleiermacher. The first thing he's thinking is that modern Protestant theology from the 19th century on has tried to make peace sort of, with the emerging ethos sort of science and the authority of science and reason and so forth. It also sort of is trying to make peace sort of with that there's attempts sort of, to try and find the common coinage between religion and secular society. And the common coinage probably might be ethics. So Immanuel Kant sort of is playing a major role with respect to this. So we wanted to have a form of Christianity which is indeed of the modern world. This is the first move, which sort of does in fact grant to scientific reason really the protocol of what reason looks like. But we do add sort of in addition to that, there may sort of be relations between each other sort of where we can't sort of have science patrol that, so that we have to have ethics patrol sort of our behavior. That's the first part. He criticizes that. So liberal Protestant theology is that which he's rebelling against. And of course he has the First World War to indicate just what did we get sort of out sort of of reason, in a sense that reason sort of can go insane, and reason can sometimes be the method by which we kill people, not the method by which we avoid killing them. First. Second, he does spend sort of a long life, some blowing hot and cold, usually hot, of course. He's Karl Barth, so it's going to be hot, against Friedrich Schleiermacher, as offering a kind of seductive alternative to kind of modern sort of liberal Protestantism. He thinks in the end, of course, it's just continuing by other means. But it's a more romantic profile, where sort of, we're not thinking that reason is primary. We're thinking that there is a native religious instinct or feeling and so forth. And, of course, it looks pretty good, because what Schleiermacher's going to say is, initially, we have this feeling whereby we can sort of go beyond ourselves with respect to the cosmos. But eventually he kind of settles down and looks a little bit more like an Orthodox theologian by saying that what's really primitive about Christianity is my feeling of absolute dependence upon sort of, something or other, which, of course, we'll end up calling God. And the problem with that is, the problem sort of with respect to feeling sort of is, well, one can understand sort of how you might diagnose the feeling sort of is going to get to elements of our character which reason does not. But then it does mean, among other things, that only that which fits your feeling is that which is real. And the Christian message sort of isn't about sort of whether you feel good, sort of about whether God exists and God is the properties God has and how God is treating you and so forth. It is that God is there. God is there. And God sort of is not asking for permission sort of to appear on the stage of your imagination. Right? Christ did not actually, again, also ask for permission for your feeling to appear on the stage of Revelation either, right? So that I think is an analog. I think that of course sort of Barth sort of and Balthasar had a significant relationship, right? There's still going to be sort of differences, within ecumenism and so forth. And Balthasar's great text in 1954 on Barth shows how they can relate, which is extremely significant. And Barth thought that was probably as good an ecumenical text you could possibly imagine. But also showed that there's going to be differences, that Catholicism is going to, in the end, of course, you're going to have a God who's absolutely transcendent. But there are going to be mediating institutions and so forth, which Karl Barth does not affirm. Looks like we have another question.
Thanks very much for that talk. So what do you think of this? Like, when does Christianity become a term that has actual analytic heft? And because you might think that in the 16th century, in the 17th century, even throughout most of the 18th century, these discussions were undertaken using terms not like Christianity or even religion, but the church. So one reason why I agree with you that whatever we call modernity is not reducible to the Reformation is because precisely the question at the Reformation was, where is the true church to be found?
That's right.
And that question was important because the church was an irreducible social organization that had certain functions and performed certain ways that nothing else could perform. Right. And so it seems to me that like one way of thinking about the questions that you're thinking about is not so much on the ideological terrain of modernity or Christianity, but just asking the question, when do the new claims for sovereignty posed by people like Hobbes and the French guy, whose name's escaping me, in the 16th and 17th century, when do these claims take on such practical effect that in fact the church is reduced in its function as a social institution, after which point it seems like you inhabit something called modernity. So one way of responding would be to say that the horizon of modernity is just the horizon of the nation state, and the reason why there's no end to modernity on sight, at least in the immediate future, is because there doesn't seem to be any end to the nation state in the immediate future. So just if you could respond.
Right. I mean, there are really two aspects of the question. And one part I can affirm, the other part I think I want to dissent. So the part I want to affirm is that, look, a thick description of modernity and its emergence and the various ways in which we have practices and forms of life, not just simply ideas, but that we actually have emergent practices which themselves create ideas, because we have an independent state of being which is not regulated by the actual sovereign, that is the sovereignty of God, but a kind of putative sovereign who has or is supposed to have power over us, and which is central with respect to thinking of what a state is and central with respect to organization of a state. Surely we'd have to say that kind of practice, the fact that we're thinking of that, the fact that we're thinking of, unlike Thomas Aquinas, that we're not talking about positive law and how we regulate a state. Under there are two other manifolds of law. Let's say we're talking about eternal law, or heavenly law, or natural law, and heavenly law. Now we're talking about this becoming a free radical. How do we actually organize a society? Because now what we've done is we've put in brackets that there is natural law, which supersedes a positive law, how we organize a society. And we refuse to make a reference with respect to eternal law. So clearly, in any proper description of the rise of modernity, that particular aspect would have to be handled as part of a complex description. You're right. I did in fact talk about the ideological frame, but it has actually practical correlatives precisely of the sort that you're talking about. So each of us can have our different entree. What I would want to say is that if I enter in this particular way, and this is germane in fact to talking about theology rather than social theory, I do take my entry seriously, but it has to be complemented by the discourse, your kind of discourse. Similarly, however, I'd want to say that no, I would have to reject what I think is a stronger claim you're making. So I accept a weaker version of the claim you're making. If you're saying that with respect to modernity, that this is the Archimedean point, or this is the real way of understanding, I'd say no. I think this is one element of a complex whole. And to get, I think, to the first question, without, I think, your insistence on that this is the real truth of the matter. It is a significant part of the truth, but it's not the real truth of the matter. to get to the initial question, a query I think you had, a wonderment or a bafflement you had, when is it the case sort of that Christianity functions like a hypothesis, that we stand outside the confessions and we stand at our particular churches, which are duking it out, of course, right? We stand outside and then sort of have a general abstract label. When did that happen? And then what are the ways in which then sort of it was used? Well, look, I mean, I think so the answer, there are different answers depending upon sort of where sort of you're going to place yourself geographically, I think, in the modern world. And let's say for the moment, sort of I just want to concentrate briefly on Great Britain or England and Germany. I think the first answer sort of is, when did it become sort of Christianity become a general term? I think John Locke tells you it becomes a general term. It becomes a general term sort of because when John Locke in Tolerance and the Reasonableness of Christianity, when sort of he is doing that, what sort of he's saying is, goodbye to the confessions, because what the confessions have done is they've caused mayhem, right? You cannot have a workable public because when people have deep convictions, let's say deep convictions about the Eucharist, whether it's transubstantiation, real presence, or a sign, for instance, right? These are real disputes that occur, right? These are things about which people get fanatical, he thinks, right? These are overbeliefs about which people get fanatical. Okay, fanaticism sort of might just be aesthetically disturbing property. But of course, it's not simply an aesthetically disturbing property, because when people get fanatical, what do? Well, they do what jihad does. They kill each other, right? So what you're going to, what Locke is going to do is, he's going to create sort of a space of tabulation. This occurs sort of at the end of the 17th century. A space of tabulation whereby you're going to say, look, these come under the genius of Christianity, right? But what we need is, we need a purified, rational form of Christianity whereby we don't have these confessional overbeliefs whereby people are going to kill themselves, or kill each other, rather. So Locke, I mean, there are people before Locke, but if you want sort of the summary sort of, of where it occurred and where now sort of, you have Christianity as a genius and we have species of the confessions, that sort of is one of the places where it occurs. Fast forward to the 19th century, almost 100 years later, Germany is lagging behind. It hasn't lagged behind much since then, but Immanuel Kant is going to do something similar. His situation sort of is less perplexing and less immediate than Locke. Locke sort of had been looking back at the 100 Years' War. He's been looking at the battle sort of between the Royalists and the Puritans and so forth. This is absolutely real. So when he's writing on tolerance, look, even though he's the most boring philosopher that ever sort of walked the face of the earth, he's also incredibly important because he's dealing with real stuff. Immanuel Kant isn't dealing with real stuff later on, who is a much greater philosopher. So when Immanuel Kant writes sort of in 1793, Religion Within the Boundaries of Reason Alone, he's doing something a little bit more like an academic exercise, which he, of course, does much better than John Locke. But for that particular purpose, again, it's Christianity as a genius. And he's asking sort of, well, to what extent can Christianity, which has a certain kind of belief system, like, for instance, belief in God, uncomfortable, but belief in God, belief sort of that somehow or other there can be renovation of character, but put it that way. That's a highly abstract way, because that's the only way he's going to sort of affirm it. We would say redemption, right, by another, but he doesn't really want that, and so forth. And he wants to believe that there's a certain kind of fragility in human beings, which looks like sort of sin and so forth. So he wants to say, okay, what is redeemable about Christianity as a totality? Now, he decides that, well, look, Protestant Christianity is going to do better than many other forms of Christianity. Catholicism is going to do hopeless in this thing. But Catholicism did hopeless in Locke as well, right, as you well know. So in other words, that in terms, nominally, Catholicism is Christian. But then sort of, it really sort of is discouraged as being sort of an example at all. But what Kant is doing is that in that text, Kant wants to say there are these sets of religious beliefs about renovation of character, creation, and so forth, and progress. We are being renovated individually and by community. And something, those Christian symbols are really good. They're kind of good reminders to us. They're good memory sticks with respect sort of to how sort of we might actually sort of behave ethically sort of in the modern world. But of course, you have to realize, he says, that the only thing that we sort of can codify, the only thing that we can validate is the ethical behavior. But what we can validate is, we can validate that someone has saved us, and perhaps probably we shouldn't validate that Christ has saved us, because that sort of would derogate from our autonomy, our freedom. Like that someone would, if you save me, right, if Michael saves me, well, good for me, I get saved. That's good, that's a benefit. But the fact is, who the hell did he think he is that he's going to save me? Right? So Kant already has that point, that To be saved is already sort of to be somehow less than you can be. Therefore, you're not saved. There's a kind of self-saving operation, etc. That's the second moment at which we have sort of Christianity as a general label. Now, what that does is, like, I mean, the irony of all abstractions is that they're winners and losers, right? So John Locke sort of, John Locke, I says, makes Christianity within, again, sort of, he's going to rationalize it. But it's quite clear that he says that this sort of, if you understand this, and if all of you back off, so those of you who are Trinitarian, forget it, right? Forget it. Those of you who have Baha'i Christology, forget it. We'll all agree, I mean, this is like sort of Cold War at the tone. We can all agree in the following, that Jesus is the Messiah. And someone would say, does that mean, shut up, don't talk. That's right. We don't, so what we're saying is, not merely that we're saying something very minimal, we're insisting that only the minimal sort of be said, because anything more than the minimum is going to cause wreak havoc, right? That's the moment of minimalism now being a moral imperative. So in 1690 and 1695, there's two iterations. John Locke, the most boring philosopher ever on earth, I think he was a bachelor, he probably would have driven his wife crazy, sort of. But this boring person did something to us that is untoward. That is, suggested to us, which incapacitates us with respect to Islam, incapacitates us entirely, because we have been indoctrinated that the only form of religion which is tolerable in the modern world is that which is minimal without conviction. Without conviction. So therefore, what you have to do is that essentially Christianity has to be castrated in order to be modern. And in this instance, Catholics need not apply. Catholics cannot be part of the state because Catholics, well, of course, A, would not be part of the nation state, so I'm going to give you that.
Well, I would just say the precondition for why I'm saying all this stuff is the English church has already been absorbed into the state. So I just want to make a Marxist point.
Right, okay, right.
That the political fact is prior to the ideological articulation.
And I'm not sure that I would want sort of to really contest that. I mean, I think it can go either way. I mean, what I will contest is, I will contest the Marxist principle, but not this particular fact, okay? That sometimes it goes the other way, that you can bring a fact into by an ideology. So I think in Marxism itself, in its own self-correction process, it's a two-way street, depending, and you have to have an empirical analysis of which of it is, right? So for instance, that's right, exactly. Look, I want to say something to the students. That is, I say to my students at Notre Dame, there are no stupid questions. There are only stupid answers. And you're not giving an answer. So the only person who's likely to be stupid is myself.
In spite of my gray hair, I am a student. I have a question about a presumption of Musil, and you carried it through in your presentation several times, and that is the presumption of the stability of modernity now that we're here. It is true that it appears to be stable and has been, but can we actually be? And here I'm not sure quite how to state this, but can we actually be confident in the sense that we're not in a period in which we have had a long period of relative clarity that we are post-Enlightenment, but in fact we are just in the eye of the hurricane, and there are interesting times ahead, precipitated by a number of potential external factors that could radically change what is now perceived as the field belonging to the modern age.
That's right. Okay, look, there is nothing about the question, I think, sort of that I would suggest is impertinent or unimportant. It seems to be a very important question. Now, it is the case that the two people I put on the map, and my written paper is much longer than this, but I decided it's better to have a conversation, I think, so than to keep talking. Their presumption is that we are in these two manifolds, which make us, or which are part of our essential makeup. Now, to diagnose that and to suggest that nonetheless Christianity can engage and Christianity can contest is to suggest that the future is open. In other words, just simply in principle, it is to say that we've got to understand that this sort of is our long-term, has been our long-term condition, is likely to continue in the future. But that's not the same as saying that we are changed utterly and that utter change is itself going to remain. We don't. The purpose of what Henri de Lubac and Hans von Balthasar is to suggest that Christianity sort of was an agent in its own dismissal. I mean, it's obviously sometimes an agent on the moral platform of its own dismissal, right? It's an agent sometimes sort of in simply asserting as bald facts things which can't be bald facts. It's an agent insofar as it sometimes puts the second and third rate of what sort of is Christian and Catholic to the fore rather than the first rate, etc. So all kinds of ways in which we are Christians sort of throughout, but think of Catholics, can hobble the perdurance of all Christianity. But obviously, their kind of work, you remember for what? You remember for the future that can be. And of course, you remember for the future that can be because you're saying that God sort of is the absolute future, and God is in fact the absolute sovereign of history. So, working sort of through sort of these relatively dark times, but only relatively dark times. It's not the case sort of that, at least in the Catholic manifold, everything about what has happened sort of is bad. But enough about it has happened, which is prescriptive with respect to real Christianity sort of surviving. But they assume that Christianity will survive. Or they assume sort of that whether it survives or not, the task, which is in God's hands, right? Because we are not the lords of history. God is the Lord of history in the end. But I think in this Catholic kind of circumstance, the task of the theologian is to be involved in persuasion in the secular culture. Persuasion by speech, persuasion by imagination, persuasion by action, of how Christianity sort of is redolent of a humanity sort of beyond comprehension, and also redolent of something more than humanity, which is totally beyond comprehension. So the history is open. We do not know. Everything is not over. Its overness will have got to do sort of with God, and will have obviously somewhat got to do so with the kind of actions that we're likely to perform sort of in sort of the next 100 years or whatever it's going to be, if we do have 100 years. So in that sense, I think, point sustained. That is, we are not talking about modernity as a fatal condition, that once it comes, it's going to last forever. Nor are we even suggesting that it's affected everyone sort of equally. It never has, and probably never will. It just affects most of us most of the time, right? That's the important point. And as of yet, we're involved in catch-up with respect to it. We thought that we might have made our peace with the first, but probably we didn't manage that because that keeps replicating itself in different ways. So we continually have to readjust to taking care of the first manifold. There are different ways in which we also have to, the second manifold, which I gave you, illustrations back in the 18th and 19th century. And those are cozy because they're in the 19th century, right? But I want to say they recycle in different ways now too. We have to take care of those. So what I think they want to say is, I think it's a call to arms. It's a call to remembering. And remembering is remembering forward. It's not remembering, you only remember backward in order to move on. That's all that you're doing. So Christianity is about moving on. Christianity is about tomorrow. It's not about yesterday. This is a call to action, a call to memory as a form of action, practical action as well as theoretical action. The future is open. Christianity is not dead, despite the prophets of doom, despite the so-called death of God. It is not dead. What particular form or shape it will have in the future, we do not know. But in the meantime, the task sort of is to be Christian, to perform Christianly, ethically, politically, ecclesially, sacramentally, and so forth. To be struck by the beauty of it. The beauty of it. That Christianity sort of is worth living for as well as worth dying for. But it is worth living for. They want, I think, to give us something to live for, something to be joyous with. Much more joyous than sort of what is given sort of in either of these other kind of more imminent frames. The future sort of is the future sort of the not known outcome of Christianity sort of and the modern world, the non-known outcome sort of Islam and the modern world, the unknown outcome of the world as such. So yeah, you're absolutely right. But I think this memory is not in any way nostalgic. It is that can we get something from the past? Can we learn something from our own connivances, which have got us nowhere? Can sort of we find ways in which we will continue to dialogue with modernity? It's not to say with Barth an absolute 999. You will negotiate, but you also remember those things which are unnegotiable, right? So Christianity is about the measure of negotiation versus the measure of the non-negotiation, and sometimes it determines the spirits as to what's negotiable and what isn't negotiable, right? But it is the case, Christianity is about the unknown future, and about sort of us moving towards an unknown future. And the task, I think, of theology, the task of Christians, the task of Catholicism in general, the task of continuing the liturgy and so forth, is to make that future, and is to make not merely that Christianity will continue, right? That to continue there is no benefit, right? There is no benefit. To continue would actually sort of make Christianity the religion of zombies. Zombies continue. You don't want Christianity to continue, simply continue. You want Christianity to continue because you have a conviction that it's not simply that God is sovereign, right, and is the upholder of history. You want to say, this is God's world, right? This is God's world, and you want to participate in this world as a godly world. That's your task, to find your way to do that, to replicate that, to hand that on to the future, and then hopefully that particular future is a future of enjoyment of the presence of God, where these if you like, two layers have been more or less mastered. But we do not know what other challenges are on the way, and we do not know whether Christianity will survive. We can guess it may survive. We don't know what particular form it will survive, but it will and only can survive with an identity in which it is in fact Christian, and where we have the grammar of Christianity still in place. It would not have been forgotten, and it will not have been replaced. That, I think, is the task.
Professor O'Regan, I think I speak on behalf of all of us when I say that yours is the lecture that we will remember for a very long time. Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody for coming.